So I guess that's the question on the table. Like, you know, when I think about like black people, particularly like black Americans, you know, to me and black people in general, like we're the first to give solidarity,
right?
And we're the last to receive solidarity.
And I like when you said that solidarity is a two-way street.
Absolutely. But should that be a reason that, you know, we don't get involved? Because, you know, should that be a reason? The fact that, like, you know, we're not hearing, and oftentimes when black people are dying, we don't hear about it. Oftentimes when it comes to our situation, we don't get the same amount of solidarity I would say that we give. Should that be a reason for us not to be involved in, you know, the crisis that's happening right now in the Middle East?
I think it's a nuanced conversation. And if anybody will recall back to a few weeks ago on the Rumors of War episode, this was a point that I made.
Right.
I made the point of, what about the black people in Palestine? What about the black Arabs? What about the Africans in Palestine, Jerusalem, and Israel that were Sudanese, Eritrean, Ethiopian, correct, right? Other peoples of African.
And also, not to cut you off, there's African-American Jews in Israel as well.
There's African-American Jews in Israel, correct. So, again, it becomes a nuanced conversation, and I think that black people were always expected to mule for whatever cause it is. Black people, because we have so much social capital influence, right, are looked at as the people who should shoulder the burden of all the world's struggles. Like, we should just bear this cross and uplift every single cause. And while it's admirable to show up for every fight, we still have issues of our own that need attended to. We still have to walk the planet as black people and deal with, you know, police violence here. We still have to deal with, you know, white supremacy and all this legislation that happens and shows up in a way to oppress black people. So I think that Dr. Umar makes a strong point. I can't believe I actually said that on there.
We have it on record.
Jesus Christ. He makes a strong point. Now, I'm not saying I agree with all of his points ever.
Right.
But it's hard to find you know, the hole in that in that statement. You know what I mean? Because, like, no one shows up for Congo. No one shows.
We haven't seen. I mean,
we haven't seen any UN and nothing.
Not a protest, a march. I haven't seen anybody really raise that issue. In fact, I'm just finding out, like, as a black person. And
we talked about it before the show. Like, you asked me in Miracle, do we know about this? I was like, but, like, you know, it doesn't receive coverage.
I knew about, like, obviously, you know, when you think about the Congo, you think about all the precious resources that come out of the Congo.
Absolutely.
Like, we wouldn't have iPhones,
right,
if it wasn't for, like, the cobalt.
Do you know how much an iPhone would cost if it was made in America?
No.
Your iPhone would cost roughly between $15,000 to $20,000.
Oh, wow.
If it was completely American made. But because of the labor practices used in the DRC, they can make it, you know, what it is now.
I was about to say, put some wheels on that motherfucker.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's
let me drive it around. It's gonna be 15 to 20.
But I mean, think about it. Like, if it was today, would you hear about Rwanda?
Right. I mean, and that was part of even, you know, going back to when there was, you know, those mass atrocities that took place in Rwanda. Mm-hmm. Again, at least me, but most people didn't find out till after it was over, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And even then, you know,
because that was during Clinton administration,
right? Yeah. And even then, like, oftentimes, like, what happens in Africa on the continent isn't really brought. And oftentimes, even if it is, it's brought like through a white supremacist lens.
Yes, like, look at these savages.
Correct.
Look at this third world country or developing nation.
Right. Not necessarily like you know, individuals that are fighting for resistance or trying to, you know, take ownership over the resources that come from their country. Like, like billions and like multi-billions, trillions of dollars of resources come from a place like the Congo, and the people that live there get paid the least amount. And so I guess it brings that up. Like, one, you know, why doesn't it come to the forefront in the manner that it does? And I think, again, it's like, do we owe solidarity to oppressed communities in the world? Like, is another question or conversation. Did you want to, Landis? It looks like you're doing a lot of texting in Miracle.
You know, it's almost like I have multiple jobs and requirements for.
Is it an election coming up, Miracle?
Almost like that. So obviously, I have a different interpretation of what that man says, because it is how you define solidarity and what is that litmus test, right? when we're talking about
Set
what's
the litmus
happening
test.
in the Middle East, Palestinian people for decades have stood with Black people, have advocated for Black causes. Is it 85% or 95% of the people? No. Again, most of the people especially in Gaza, are children. But we do know there were Black Lives Matter protests in Gaza and the West Bank, and there were murals, and there have been, travels and building. So there has been some semblance of solidarity. But again, what can people who have occupied done for solidarity that would make people feel comfortable in coming out? And so I would push back on Dr. Umar's point. But what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Haiti, what's happening in basically the global South is our elected officials are going to these places and taking their resources, disrupting their governments, so that when the UN does a resolution, we as the United States basically use our powers to make other countries vote against these resolutions. And then we go and destroy these countries when they don't do what we want, whether it's what happened in Libya, what's happening in El Salvador. We destroy and disrupt Black and brown countries all of the time, and then turn around and say, well, this country isn't fighting enough for Black Americans, so I'm not going to go and fight back. A lot of us have been organizing around being anti-war and have been called, radical, anti-American. And so there's also a conversation about the risk that happen when you try to be in solidarity with different communities. When you go to these rallies, I sit with people who wonder if by signing a petition, does that mean that they're sentencing their families to death? When we were covering what was happening in Ethiopia on the Power Hour, we had to sit there and say, what happens if our guest's family is brutalized after this episode airs? And so there is also a drawback and an inherent risk when you're trying to uplift struggles on an international level, right? Not only from our government, but for the people who are still in those countries, because they always threaten people's families when they start to speak out. And so being in Western environments isn't even safe for some of these individuals who are trying to practice solidarity, who are trying to spread awareness. And that is why white supremacy is able to really fester on a global scale.